May 7, 1945. The setting was a requisitioned German estate on the outskirts of Frankfurt, where two architects of Allied triumph sat across from each other at an elaborate desk. Beyond those walls, American troops reveled without restraint, drinking, hollering, shooting weapons skyward in unbridled joy. Nazi Germany had capitulated at last. The conflict that had devoured Europe, the darkness that had engulfed an entire continent, had officially concluded. Within that hushed chamber, George S. Patton was not rejoicing. He examined the figure opposite him, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the masterful coordinator of Allied success across Europe. Patton hadn't arrived to commemorate their victory. He'd come to deliver a caution he understood Eisenhower would reject. Statements that would fracture their bond, obliterate his own future, and be labeled insanity by authorities and journalists alike. "We're going to have to battle them eventually," Patton declared, his tone measured and unwavering. "Let's engage them now while our military is whole and victory is assured." His subject wasn't the Germans. Their empire lay in fragments. His subject was the Soviet Union. For an extended moment, Eisenhower simply observed him. For 3 years, he'd meticulously preserved an alliance with Joseph Stalin's government, juggling personalities, philosophies, and strategic imperatives to vanquish Adolf Hitler. In American publications, Stalin was Uncle Joe, the rough-hewn but endearing comrade in triumph. Newsreels depicted the Red Army as valiant saviors. American youngsters gathered scrap and applauded their Soviet partners. And here stood Patton, America's most aggressive field commander, calmly proposing that the United States redirect its weapons toward that ally without delay, before the ashes from Germany's collapse had even settled. "George, you lack understanding of politics," Eisenhower ultimately responded. "The war has ended. We're returning home." In that instant, Patton recognized something that troubled him more profoundly than any combat zone he'd ever witnessed. Eisenhower grasped precisely what he was suggesting. On some plane, Ike recognized that Patton's evaluation of the Soviet danger was correct, yet he also recognized he would never implement it. The political cost was insurmountable. What transpired next was among the most significant silences in American military chronicle. An opening, if one existed at all, shut quietly without a single round being discharged. Patton had developed his assessment not from theoretical concepts, but from what his Third Army had witnessed firsthand as they penetrated deeper into Central Europe than any other Allied formation. His armored units had swept across Germany into Czechoslovakia and pressed against the unclear, fluctuating boundary dividing Western forces from Soviet-controlled zones. Wherever his path took him, he observed something that disturbed him far more than the shattered remains of Hitler's Wehrmacht. He observed the Red Army. Patton's officers and intelligence personnel reported scenes that startled even battle-hardened veterans. Soviet forces weren't behaving like temporary liberators. They were behaving like occupiers planning permanent residence. Intelligence flowed in describing methodical pillaging, settlements stripped completely of equipment and animals, rail cars loaded with seized machinery traveling eastward. There were descriptions of widespread sexual violence, savage retribution, and immediate executions of civilians suspected of anti-communist leanings. Whole communities were being gathered and transported to Soviet work camps. Patton harbored no illusions about warfare. He knew savagery personally. But what he witnessed in Eastern Europe persuaded him that the Soviet Union wasn't a collaborator in constructing a new democratic framework. It was a totalitarian empire expanding its frontiers westward. In April 1945, he corresponded with his wife Beatrice in characteristic directness. He confessed having no interest in comprehending the Russians emotionally, only in determining how much ammunition would be required to eliminate them if circumstances demanded. They conveyed to him, he recorded, the sense of a power that must be regarded with apprehension in any future reorganization of global authority. While American diplomats in Washington continued hoping that Stalin would respect commitments of free elections and national independence, Patton was observing those commitments dissolve in real time. He encountered American prisoners of war who'd fallen into Soviet custody near the conflict's conclusion. Their accounts disturbed him more than German imprisonment ever had. They recounted having their timepieces, footwear, and provisions stolen. Officers who objected were assaulted or executed. They recounted circumstances so horrific that some stated they'd favored their German captors over their Soviet liberators. The pattern persisted. Soviet formations were dismantling German industrial facilities component by component, transporting complete manufacturing plants onto trains destined for the East. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, Soviet-supported communists were seizing government facilities, police headquarters, and judicial buildings. Freedom fighters who'd endangered their lives battling Nazi occupation were now being detained, interrogated, and frequently executed, not by the Gestapo, but by Soviet intelligence services. By the moment Germany capitulated, Patton's anxieties had crystallized into a particular measured assessment. What he presented to Eisenhower, and subsequently to high-ranking authorities in Washington, wasn't the eruption of a frustrated soldier incapable of embracing peace. It was a strategic blueprint constructed on intelligence documents, battlefield observations, and a merciless examination of Soviet capabilities and vulnerabilities. His reasoning was cold and elementary. The Soviet Union had suffered a catastrophic toll to defeat Germany. Approximately 27 million of its citizens had perished. The Red Army, though enormous, was hemorrhaging. Its divisions in Eastern Europe were extended far from their logistics bases, subsisting on captured reserves, requisitioned provisions, and whatever they could seize from occupied zones. Their supply networks stretched back thousands of miles to a motherland ravaged by conflict. American forces, in contrast, stood at the zenith of their strength. They possessed absolute air dominance. Their supply networks ran back through France to Atlantic harbors, sustained by an industrial foundation untouched by enemy bombardment. American divisions were completely outfitted, well-nourished, and supported by fleets of aircraft that could, in Patton's estimation, annihilate Soviet supply and communication networks at discretion. To Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson, Patton presented his evaluation in unsparing language that same month of May 1945. We could defeat the Russians in 6 weeks. The Soviet Union, he contended, possessed no genuine strategic bombing capability. Its aerial defenses were restricted. American air superiority alone could tear Soviet logistics to fragments. On terrain, Soviet tank manufacturing was remarkable in volume, but after years of uninterrupted combat, their armored forces were deteriorated and mechanically suspect. American M4 Sherman tanks might not possess the protection of certain German or Soviet designs, but they were trustworthy, and there were thousands prepared to engage. Most critical to Patton was the human dimension. Soviet soldiers had battled ferociously to protect their territory, but now they were being commanded to occupy nations that weren't theirs, dominating populations that rejected them. Many of these troops, he suspected, possessed minimal interest in garrisoning foreign territories indefinitely. If an American offensive thrust eastward, Patton forecast that Red Army morale would disintegrate. He was convinced that substantial numbers of Soviet soldiers would capitulate, abandon their posts, or simply decline to fight. Then arrived the most contentious element of his proposal. "We can equip the Germans," Patton recommended. Across Europe, hundreds of thousands of former Wehrmacht soldiers resided in prisoner-of-war facilities, confronting ambiguous futures. Many despised and feared the Russians far more than they resented the Americans or British. In Patton's assessment, these men could be re-equipped, restructured under fresh leadership, and deployed against the Soviets. "I'd prefer a German division alongside me than a Soviet one," he documented. To the political apparatus in Washington, this recommendation was appalling. The United States had just expended tremendous resources and casualties defeating Nazi Germany. To equip German troops again, even under Allied supervision, appeared like a betrayal of everything the war had represented. But Patton's reasoning pursued a brutal mathematics. If the Soviets constituted the next menace, why not employ the adversaries of that adversary, however recently vanquished, to restrain their advancement? Within weeks, portions of Patton's statements leaked to journalists. The portrait rendered wasn't of a clear-sighted strategist executing a harsh calculation, but of a reckless militarist who'd exceeded boundaries, someone who empathized with Germans and was fixated on initiating another war. Eisenhower possessed reasons to dismiss Patton's blueprint beyond anxiety of negative publicity. The American populace desperately desired to return their sons home. Congress was already insisting on swift demobilization and cautioning against fresh European entanglements. Logistically, American forces had been positioned to occupy Germany, not to advance deeper into Poland and beyond. Supply networks would require reorganization at tremendous expense. But beneath these practical impediments resided a more fundamental obstacle: politics. Harry Truman had only recently assumed the presidency following Franklin Roosevelt's death. He remained finding his balance, still encircled by numerous Roosevelt advisors, and still publicly dedicated to a policy of cooperation with Stalin. At Yalta, the Allies had consented to a structure for post-war Europe that recognized spheres of influence and guaranteed free elections in liberated nations. To propose attacking the Soviet Union in that framework would be perceived as destroying sacred agreements. Eisenhower recognized this. If he presented a blueprint like Patton's to the president, he'd be labeled a warmonger, a figure who desired to commence a new global war just as the previous one concluded. The press would destroy him. Congress would oppose him. His standing as the composed, steady architect of triumph would be eliminated. He also authentically believed that diplomacy could function. Like numerous leaders of that period, Eisenhower anticipated that once the wartime emergency passed, the Soviet Union would temper, that tensions would diminish, and that the recently established United Nations could furnish a platform to settle disagreements. He contemplated in terms of institutions, accords, and political mechanisms. Patton contemplated in terms of windows and force. "George perceives the world as a battlefield," Eisenhower informed his chief of staff. "He doesn't comprehend that we must coexist with these people." In this controversy, Patton wasn't entirely isolated. Across the English Channel, Winston Churchill was arriving at comparable conclusions. Churchill had mistrusted Bolshevism since the Russian Revolution of 1917. He'd only partnered with the Soviets from necessity to defeat the greater immediate menace of Hitler. Even as the war concluded, he cautioned that Soviet ambitions didn't terminate with defeating the Nazis. By April 1945, Churchill was transmitting increasingly pressing messages to Truman and Eisenhower. He implored them to advance Western forces as far east as feasible before the Red Army solidified its grip. He desired American and British troops, not Soviet ones, entering cities like Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. On May 12, 1945, Churchill employed a phrase that would soon achieve fame. "An iron curtain he communicated to Truman, is drawn down upon their front. Behind that barrier, he cautioned, nobody truly understood what was transpiring, but he suspected that liberty was being extinguished. That same month, Churchill instructed his military planners to construct a bold and unsettling concept: Operation Unthinkable. It was fundamentally an Allied assault designed to expel Soviet forces from Poland and Eastern Europe, utilizing re-equipped German formations alongside British and American divisions. The British Chiefs of Staff examined the concept. Their determination was sobering, but not dismissive. Under appropriate circumstances, and if implemented immediately, they believed such an operation was militarily achievable. It would be expensive and demand total dedication, but it might prevail in forcing the Red Army backward. Churchill transmitted the blueprint to Truman. The American president scarcely hesitated before dismissing it. The notion of attacking the Soviet Union, particularly with German soldiers fighting under Allied command, revolted him. The political and moral ramifications were too monumental to contemplate. When Patton discovered that Churchill had contemplated fundamentally the identical strategy he'd championed, he experienced a bitter vindication. At least one figure in authority comprehends what we're confronting, he informed his staff. Within months, Churchill's apprehensions started materializing. Soviet domination over Eastern Europe solidified. Promised elections were postponed, manipulated, or eliminated outright. Opposition leaders vanished into prisons or graves. Communist parties supported by Soviet security forces seized control of police, bureaucracies, and publications. Back in the United States, the manner journalists discussed Patton transformed dramatically. During the war, he'd been characterized as a vibrant, if controversial, hero, the flamboyant tank commander whose profane addresses motivated troops and terrified Germans. In May and June 1945, though, the tenor shifted. Reporters seized upon his harsh declarations about the Soviets and his recommendation to re-equip German formations. Columnist Drew Pearson labeled Patton's statements deeply troubling, suggesting that the general's judgment might be deteriorating. At a moment when the nation yearned for peace, Pearson stated Patton appeared determined to pursue another catastrophic war. Editorials in prominent newspapers contended that his remarks demonstrated a dangerous ignorance of diplomatic reality. Magazines openly speculated whether this brilliant battlefield commander was simply incapable of adapting to peacetime. None of these publications seriously investigated the reports his intelligence teams were transmitting from Eastern Europe. They didn't examine Soviet atrocities or the methodical installation of puppet governments. The narrative solidified. Patton was a magnificent warrior, but also an unstable remnant of combat, unsuitable for the emerging world. Pressure on Eisenhower intensified. By August 1945, authorities in Washington were clarifying that Patton's public criticisms were unacceptable. The catalyst emerged from a completely separate policy debate: denazification. At a press conference, Patton was questioned about initiatives to eliminate all former Nazi Party members from positions in the German administration. He responded with typical bluntness. Many of these individuals, he contended, had joined the party for pragmatic reasons, not ideological dedication. To remove all of them from office was, in his words, stupid. He compared the situation to an American political race, stating that belonging to the Nazi Party in Germany was often no more significant than being a Democrat or a Republican back home. The statement was explosive. Reported without nuance, it sounded like Patton was equating membership in a murderous totalitarian movement with participation in a mainstream American political party. Headlines accused him of minimizing Nazi atrocities. Politicians condemned him. The controversy provided Eisenhower the justification he required. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower removed Patton from command of the Third Army. Officially, the reason was his inappropriate statements about denazification. Unofficially, everyone in Patton's circle understood that his relentless cautions about the Soviets had performed an equally significant role. Stripped of command, Patton spent his remaining months in Europe doing what he could: observing, documenting, and cautioning. His correspondence from October and November 1945 reads like a fusion of military analysis and prophecy. He urged American leaders to maintain a posture of strength, to keep their boots polished and bayonets honed, and to display to the Red Army an unmistakable image of power. This, he insisted, was the only language Moscow truly comprehended. If the United States disarmed and relaxed, he cautioned, triumph over Germany would prove hollow. They might have defeated one adversary only to surrender the field to another. In early December of that year, Patton met again with Undersecretary Patterson. He presented his grim forecast. The Soviets, he stated, wouldn't withdraw from Eastern Europe. They would transform temporary occupation into permanent domination. They would disseminate communism through Western Europe by subversion, intimidation, and, when necessary, force. Eventually, the United States would be drawn into military conflict with them. We're going to battle them eventually, he reiterated. In 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, we'll regret. We didn't act in 1945 when we possessed the opportunity. Patterson listened courteously. Then he delivered the same response Eisenhower had in more bureaucratic terminology. Washington possessed no appetite for confrontation. The American people desired peace, not another crusade. Whatever Patton observed on the ground, his proposed resolution was politically unattainable. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff vehicle was involved in an accident near Mannheim. A truck suddenly turned across his vehicle's trajectory. The general was propelled forward, sustaining a severe neck injury that paralyzed him from the neck downward. Other occupants in the car departed with minor injuries. Patton, the figure who'd survived innumerable battles at the front, was fatally wounded in what appeared to be an ordinary traffic accident. He lingered in a hospital bed for almost 2 weeks, unable to move. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died at the age of 60. The timing of the accident and the peculiar circumstances surrounding it generated rumors and speculation almost immediately. Some indicated the truck driver's strange statements. Others noted the coincidence that the one general most outspoken about the Soviet menace had been silenced days after delivering a final dire caution to Washington. But no concrete evidence of assassination has ever surfaced. The more reasonable conclusion is that it was a tragic accident, one that nevertheless eliminated from the stage the loudest voice, demanding a confrontation with Moscow at its weakest moment. In the years that followed, events unfolded in a pattern that eerily reflected Patton's cautions. By 1946, Soviet authority in Eastern Europe was cemented. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all fell under communist governance. The free elections promised at Yalta proved to be an illusion. In Poland, resistance leaders who'd battled the Nazis for 6 years were arrested, tried on fabricated charges, and either executed or dispatched to labor camps deep inside the Soviet Union. In Czechoslovakia, a communist coup in 1948 toppled the democratic government. That same year, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk died in a mysterious fall from a window, officially ruled suicide, but widely suspected to be murder. The pattern repeated across nation after nation. Soviet occupation was followed by the installation of communist governments, the crushing of opposition parties, the seizure of property, and the creation of secret police loyal to Moscow. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the broader Soviet bloc killed approximately 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or lived under daily oppression. The Iron Curtain that Churchill had described became a literal border of barbed wire, concrete barriers, and guard towers. The Cold War that Patton had wanted to prevent lasted roughly 45 years. It cost trillions of dollars in military expenditure and claimed millions of lives in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Angola. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly and beginning an era of mutual assured destruction. By 1950, confronted with North Korean aggression supported by Moscow and Beijing, the United States found itself in precisely the kind of military clash with communist forces that Patton had predicted, except now under far more perilous circumstances. Patton's contention had never been that war with the Soviets could be prevented entirely. His assertion was that the moment of Germany's surrender in 1945 was the safest time to confront them militarily. The Red Army was exhausted. Soviet industry was in ruins. American power was at its peak. If the confrontation was inevitable, he believed, better to face it then than to wait for the Soviets to recover, rearm, and acquire nuclear weapons. Whether his military judgment was entirely sound remains debated among historians and strategists. What's far less debatable is that the broad outline of his cautions was confirmed by what followed. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe did become effectively permanent until the late 1980s. Communist expansion did spread worldwide. Military confrontation with communist forces did occur repeatedly at tremendous cost. By 1947, even many progressives who'd supported Roosevelt's more optimistic approach to Moscow had to acknowledge that something fundamental had gone wrong. George Kennan's famous long telegram from Moscow described the Soviet system as inherently expansionist and ideologically committed to undermining the West. Language that, in more measured tones, closely echoed Patton's visceral cautions from 1945. The Truman Doctrine, announced that same year, committed the United States to a policy of containing Soviet influence wherever it attempted to spread. But containment arrived with its own tragic costs. It accepted Soviet domination of Eastern Europe as a grim reality, drawing the line further west. It meant fighting limited wars in Asia instead of risking a general war in Europe. It meant living for decades under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Conservative critics would later hold up Patton as a prophetic figure, a man who'd seen what others refused to see. General Douglas MacArthur, who would clash with Truman over strategy in the Korean War, wrote that Patton understood the nature of communism and knew it had to be confronted with force. His removal, MacArthur argued, was a tragedy with lasting consequences. Decades later, Ronald Reagan invoked Patton's cautions as he argued that the United States must take a stance of strength and moral clarity toward what he called the evil empire. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some conservatives looked back to Patton's May 1945 conversation with Eisenhower. Reagan's policy of military buildup and confrontation, they argued, vindicated Patton's instincts. If the Soviet system could ultimately be broken by pressure, then perhaps in some alternate timeline where Patton's counsel had been followed, Eastern Europe might have been liberated 45 years. But the question of whether Patton's proposed attack would have succeeded is ultimately impossible to answer. The political reality of 1945 made his blueprint almost unthinkable for democratic leaders. Regardless of its military prospects, the United States and Britain were exhausted, their people desperate for peace. They'd just emerged from a catastrophe whose full horrors were still being discovered in the death camps. To ask those societies to launch another war immediately, this time against a recent ally, was asking for something they were almost certainly incapable of providing. Patton's tragedy, then, wasn't simply that he was correct. It was that he may have been correct at a moment when his country couldn't act on that truth. His story raises questions that haven't disappeared. When should the United States confront an emerging threat militarily, rather than relying on diplomacy and hope? How far should generals go in pushing for strategies that are militarily viable but politically impossible? When do political leaders have an obligation to override public opinion and act preemptively? And when does such action become recklessness? Similar debates echoed after the September 11th attacks, when policymakers argued over whether to use preemptive force against terrorist networks and their state sponsors. They echo again as America confronts the rise of China and the expansion of its power. Do you confront a rival power early, while the balance of force favors you? Or do you wait, hoping that engagement and negotiation will moderate their ambitions? Patton represents one pole of that argument, the warrior who believes threats should be crushed while they're still weak. Eisenhower in 1945 represented the other, the coalition builder who believes in diplomacy, institutions, and the slow machinery of politics. In that sense, Eisenhower's treatment of Patton can be interpreted in two very different ways. On one reading, the system functioned as intended. A general who refused to accept civilian authority was relieved. Military power remained subordinate to elected leadership. On another reading, the system failed. A general who'd correctly identified a looming strategic threat was sidelined because his cautions were inconvenient and uncomfortable. Eisenhower himself would later acknowledge that he and others underestimated the nature of the Soviet threat in those early post-war years, but he never conceded that Patton's proposal of immediate military action against Moscow had been either wise or practical. From his perspective, the politics, the exhaustion of his troops, and the weight of obligations all made such a move irresponsible. Patton didn't care about political practicality. He cared about defeating what he perceived as America's next enemy before that enemy grew stronger. That was the lens through which he viewed history, war, and his own responsibility. He died on December 21, 1945, in a hospital bed in Germany, paralyzed, far from the battlefields he cherished. At his request, he was buried not in a grand national cemetery in the United States, but among the soldiers of the Third Army in Luxembourg, the men with whom he'd fought and bled. In death, Patton became larger than life, a symbol onto which different groups projected their own values. To many conservatives, he embodied the clarity and courage to name evil and advocate force when needed. To many liberals, he represented the dark side of militarism, the man who too readily reached for war as a solution. To most of the public, he remained the fiery tank commander who'd helped break Hitler's grip on Europe. The question of whether he was correct about the Soviet Union was answered not by debates, but by events. Permanent Soviet control of Eastern Europe for decades, global communist expansion, and a Cold War that reshaped world politics until the end of the 20th century. Whether his chosen solution would have prevented that history or plunged the world into something worse, we'll never know. What we do know is that George S. Patton saw, in the spring of 1945, a danger that others preferred not to acknowledge. He spoke about it plainly, refused to be quiet, and paid for that refusal with his career and possibly with his life. The leaders who rejected his caution spent the next 45 years struggling to manage the consequences of the reality he'd attempted to confront. His voice still resonates, a reminder that there are moments when the person who sees most clearly is also the one most easily labeled dangerous, unstable, or extreme. Sometimes the prophet is dismissed, the truth-teller is silenced, and the warrior who insists on naming the next enemy is removed by politicians who'd rather enjoy victory than face the next storm building beyond the horizon. History has delivered its verdict on the events of 1945. Though the lessons remain disputed, the millions who suffered behind the Iron Curtain, the dissidents who died in gulags, the families torn apart by secret police, the nations whose independence was crushed beneath Soviet tanks, paid the price for decisions made in that Frankfurt mansion and in the offices of Washington. Patton grasped something that comfortable men in safe rooms often forget, that peace purchased through weakness is merely an intermission between wars, and that the enemy you refuse to face today will only grow more powerful tomorrow. His methods were harsh, his personality difficult, his solutions extreme. But his diagnosis of the Soviet threat proved devastatingly accurate. The general who cautioned that we'd battle them eventually was proven correct by history itself. The only question that remains, the question that haunts strategic thinkers to this day, is whether the price of waiting was higher than the cost of acting would have been. George S. Patton lies buried in Luxembourg, surrounded by the soldiers who followed him across Europe. His headstone is simple, identical to those around it, just as he wanted. But his legacy towers over that quiet cemetery, a monument to the costs of dismissed cautions and the terrible patience of gathering storms. The threat he predicted arrived exactly as he stated it would. Whether it could have been stopped in 1945, we'll never know. What we know is that he attempted to stop it, and for that attempt, he was silenced. Some truths are too dangerous to speak. Some cautions arrive too early to be heard. And some warriors see too clearly for their own good.